Grief wrapped around me like the heavy April rain seeping into every corner of my home. My son's words came softly, almost like a lullaby. Merge your accounts with ours. Mom, we'll take care of everything. His wife's smile was warm, but her eyes were already walking through my life-opening drawers, counting what could be hers. Days later, I stood frozen in the kitchen, the sound of her voice drifting through the porch screen. Plans to erase my name from the deed of the beach house, where James and I had once carved our initials into the wooden railing. That house was more than wood and nails. It was a promise. In that moment, I buried my grief deep enough to think clearly. I would let them see the widow they wanted to believe in, frail, compliant, willing, while quietly building an unbreakable wall around $1.2 million brick by silent brick. On the morning of James's funeral, Portland was draped in gray. Suntown. The damp air clung to my coat as I stepped out of the car, the faint scent of lilies already thick in my lungs, before I even reached the church doors. 42 years of marriage, and now I was walking in alone. The small chapel was warm, almost too warm, crowded with familiar faces. Friends from the neighborhood, a few of James's old fishing buddies, and people I hadn't seen in years. I could feel the weight of their glances. Pity, sympathy, and from a few something harder to read. My eldest, Michael, stood near the front, Rachel by his side, her hand looped through his arm. They were both dressed impeccably. Rachel's hair in a perfect chignon, a small smile tugging at her lips, even in grief. My youngest, David, was across the aisle, moving quietly through the pews, checking on me every few minutes with a glance that needed no words. The service was a blur. The pastor spoke about love, about constancy, about the kind of man James had been. I caught pieces of it, but my mind kept drifting to the empty seat beside me. My hands twisted in my lap, clutching the tissue I hadn't yet used. I kept expecting to feel James's reassuring touch on my knee, the way he always did when he knew I was bracing myself. After the final hymn, there were the handshakes, the murmured, "I'm so sorry," from a dozen mouths, the smell of damp wool and perfume as people pressed in. Michael was in his element, thanking guests, introducing Rachel to distant cousins, making sure the pastor knew we appreciated the sermon. David stayed close, helping me into my coat, guiding me toward the fellowship hall for the luncheon the church ladies had prepared. The room was lined with folding tables, the smell of ham and scalloped potatoes mixing with strong coffee. People filled their plates and found seats, the low hum of conversation rising and falling. I sat at the table closest to the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. David set a plate in front of me, the kind of small gesture that said more than any speech could. Michael and Rachel joined us a few minutes later. He sat across from me, leaning forward with that polished smile he'd perfected in business meetings. "Mom," he began. His voice pitched low. "I've been thinking. You shouldn't have to worry about money anymore. Not now." I looked at him, my fork paused halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean?" He glanced at Rachel, who gave a subtle nod. "You've always handled the bills, the accounts, the investments. But with Dad gone, it's a lot for you to manage alone. Rachel and I could take care of it all. Merge your accounts with ours, streamline everything. You wouldn't have to lift a finger." Rachel smiled, then a soft, measured thing, but her eyes flicked over my face like she was searching for cracks. "We just want to make things easier for you, Maggie," she added. The words were smooth, the tone gentle, but something in my chest tightened. James and I had built our life dollar by dollar, choosing carefully what we saved, what we spent. I'd never needed someone to handle my finances for me, least of all my own son. I forced a small smile, nodding as if I were touched by the offer. "That's very thoughtful of you." Michael relaxed back in his chair, mistaking my politeness for agreement. "It would just give you more peace of mind. You could focus on yourself, on healing. Let us take the burden." I set my fork down, folding my hands in my lap. Outside the window, the rain had slowed to a fine mist, the street glistening. I thought about the accounts, the house in Lake Oswego, the small beach property James loved so much. I thought about how many times he'd told me to keep things in my name just in case. I met Michael's gaze again, holding it a beat longer than necessary. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. David's eyes flicked between us, his brow tightening just enough for me to notice. Rachel reached for her coffee, hiding her mouth behind the cup, but not quickly enough to mask the flicker of something sharper in her expression. The conversation shifted to the weather, to the pastor's sermon, to David's latest project at work. I nodded where appropriate, let the words wash over me. But that one sentence from Michael echoed in my mind louder than the chatter around me. "You shouldn't have to worry about money anymore." It didn't sound like concern. It sounded like a beginning. A week later, the doorbell rang just after lunch. I opened it to find Michael and Rachel on the porch, Rachel holding a bouquet of tulips, Michael balancing a slim leather photo album. The April sky was still stubbornly gray, but their smiles were warm, rehearsed, the kind you bring to a real estate showing. "Thought we'd stop by?" Michael said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Rachel handed me the flowers, her perfume following her in like a second presence. "They're lovely," I said, taking them to the kitchen, filling a vase while they settled into the living room. The album lay on the coffee table, already open to a family photo from last Christmas, James in his sweater with the reindeer pattern, a rare wide grin on his face. Rachel's voice floated in from the other room. "We thought you might like these. Good memories to have close." I joined them, setting the tulips on the side table. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a few minutes we traded small talk, his latest project at Northwest Build Co., Rachel's updates about Sophie's school play. It felt almost normal, almost easy, until Michael cleared his throat and glanced at Rachel. "There's something we wanted to talk to you about, Mom," he began. I felt my spine straighten, though my expression didn't change. "Oh," he folded his hands the way he used to when asking for money in college. "We've been thinking about what we said after the funeral, about you not having to handle everything alone. We think it would be best to merge your accounts with ours. That way Rachel and I can take care of the bills, the investments, all the details. You'd have one less thing to worry about." Rachel's hand came to rest on his fingers, curling, and when she spoke, her tone was sweet enough to mask the steel underneath. "It's really about making things simpler for you, Maggie. You've been through so much. Let us take that weight off." Her eyes met mine for a fraction too long, and I caught the glint there. Sharp, measuring. It was the same look I'd seen when she spotted a designer handbag on sale, calculating whether to grab it before someone else did. I let my gaze drift to the photo album, my fingertip tracing James's smile in that Christmas picture. The accounts he and I built together flashed through my mind. Our checking the CDs, the brokerage account we'd kept separate from anything the boys knew about. Michael kept talking, outlining how it would work. It's just paperwork, really. We'd make sure everything's covered, property taxes, utilities, maintenance, and you'd still have access, of course, but without the stress of keeping track of it all. Rachel nodded along her free hand, smoothing the skirt of her dress. "We've done fine managing our finances, Maggie. We can fold yours in and make sure it's handled responsibly." Responsibly. As if I hadn't paid every bill on time for 4 decades. As if I hadn't built those accounts while also running a household, teaching full-time and caring for 2 boys. I took a slow breath, willing my voice to stay light. "That's quite an offer." Michael smiled, the corners of his eyes softening. "We just want what's best for you. What's best for me." The words landed like a pebble in deep water, rippling through all the moments I'd learned to distrust pretty packaging. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. "I'll think about it," I said, letting the pause linger just long enough for them to believe I meant it. Rachel's smile didn't reach her eyes. She squeezed Michael's hand again, then reached for the photo album. "We'll leave this here for you. Maybe it'll bring you some comfort." We talked a little longer. About the rain. Sophie's math teacher, some new restaurant downtown they wanted to try. When they left, Rachel's tulips brightened the room, but the air felt colder than when they'd arrived. I stood at the window watching their car pull away, and saw Michael glance in the rearview mirror before turning the corner, My fingers rested lightly on the photo album, but my mind was already elsewhere, quietly sorting through what they'd said and what they hadn't. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table until the steam thinned into nothing. The tulips from Rachel stood in the center, their petals already loosening, too perfect to be casual. Whoa. I decided right then that if Michael and Rachel wanted to believe I was a fragile widow, grateful for their help, I would let them. Sometimes the easiest way to learn someone's intentions is to stand still and let them show you. That night, after the house had settled into its usual creaks and the neighborhood was dark, I went to the hall closet and pulled down the old cedar box James had built me in our first year of marriage. It still smelled faintly of sawdust and cedar oil when I lifted the lid. Inside, carefully filed in manila folders, was the story of our life in paper form. I spread everything out on the dining table: bank statements, brokerage summaries, property deeds, insurance policies. The house in Lake Oswego, bought in 1987 for $92,000, now worth 10 times that. The little cottage in Seaside we'd picked up during the market slump in 2009, now a favorite summer rental. Savings accounts. CDs, the investment portfolio James had enjoyed tinkering with even in retirement. One by one I tallied the totals, the ink from my pen pressing deep into the yellow legal pad. Checking $86,000. Savings $240,000. Brokerage $540,000. Estimated property values another $350,000. Altogether just over $1.2 million. It looked so much smaller in numbers than it felt in reality. The sum of 4 decades of early mornings, side jobs, cautious spending, and quiet sacrifice. I ran my finger along the edge of the Seaside deed, remembering James hammering the "for rent" sign into the sand, grinning like a boy. We had promised each other that little house would never be sold no matter what, and yet I could almost hear Rachel's voice in Sophie's casual chatter about when we fix up the beach house. My chest tightened. This wasn't just about money. It was about history, about boundaries, about the quiet certainty that no one had the right to dismantle what we'd built without my say-so. I pulled my leather-bound journal from the kitchen drawer, the one James had given me on our 35th anniversary. Sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of paper, I wrote in my neat, deliberate script, "Don't let them know everything." I paused, then underlined it twice. The clock read past midnight by the time I returned each document to its folder, the folders to the cedar box, the box to its place in the closet. My back ached, but my mind was oddly clear. I would be the soft-spoken, grieving mother they expected to see. I would nod at their suggestions, smile at their reassurances. And while they relaxed into their certainty, I would be watching. 2 days later, I was in the kitchen rinsing coffee cups when I heard voices drifting in from the front porch. I hadn't even realized Rachel had stepped outside to take a call. The screen door was cracked just enough for her words to slip through. "Yes, once we have the power of attorney, it's straightforward. We'll also need to get her name off the deed for the Seaside place." "Uh-huh." "No, she won't argue. She trusts us." My hands froze under the stream of water. She laughed lightly at something the person on the other end said. Then her voice lowered. "The bank forms are ready. We just need to get her to sign without making it a big deal." I stood perfectly still until the screen door squeaked open and she came back in smiling, like nothing had happened. "I'll just grab my coat," she said. And in a moment, she and Michael were gone. That afternoon, I drove into downtown Lake Oswego and parked in front of Columbia Federal Bank. The rain had let up, but the sidewalks were still wet, smelling faintly of pine. Inside, the air was warm and quiet, the soft hum of the HVAC mixing with the faint scent of polished wood. Mrs. Hale Henry Davis greeted me as I approached his desk. He was in his early 50s, a calm, deliberate man I'd known since he was a junior teller. "What can I do for you today?" I sat down across from him, leaning forward slightly. "Henry, I need you to explain something to me. If I were to give my son power of attorney, what exactly could he do with my accounts?" He didn't answer right away, just studied me for a moment. "With power of attorney, he could access all your funds, transfer money, close accounts, take out loans in your name. If it's broad enough, he could even sell property. Even if I didn't agree to it, I asked. If the documents are in place, yes. Legally, he'd be acting as you. He paused. Why do you ask? I shook my head. Let's just say I've been given some advice I'm not sure I want to take. Henry folded his hands. There are ways to protect your assets without giving anyone that level of control. But it takes time. Setting up trusts, changing account structures, making sure titles and deeds are properly recorded. I nodded slowly. And if I wanted to start that process? You'd need identification proof of ownership for any property, and we'd have to work with an attorney for certain filings. It's not something we can do in one afternoon. I sat back, letting the weight of his words settle. So if someone wanted to move fast, they'd have the advantage he finished for me. We spoke for another 10 minutes, Henry outlining basic steps I could take. Secondary authentication, locking certain accounts, shifting balances so nothing large sat where it could be grabbed quickly. I took notes, careful not to write anything that would make sense to someone else if they saw the page. When I stepped back outside, the clouds were thickening again, a chill wind sweeping in from the river. I walked slowly to my car, the sound of traffic muffled under the heaviness of my thoughts. Rachel's words on the porch were still clear in my head, each one now anchored by Henry's explanation. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an overreaction on my part. They had a plan, and it was already in motion. I started the engine, watching the wipers clear a smear of rain from the windshield. I knew now that waiting too long would be a mistake, but the moves I made would have to be quiet, careful. One wrong step and they'd know I was onto them. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the first drops of rain were spattering against the hood. I sat there for a moment, listening to them tap in an uneven rhythm, and thought about how quickly trust can turn into a liability. Then I picked up my bag and went inside. The next morning, I called Henry's bank and asked for a referral to an attorney who specialized in trusts. By noon, I had an appointment with a man named Caleb Morgan, whose office was a modest brick building tucked between a bakery and a real estate agency in downtown Lake Oswego. Caleb was in his mid-40s with a calm, deliberate manner and the kind of tidy desk that made you believe he could find any document in seconds. After listening to my situation, he nodded slowly. A living trust is a smart move. It would put your assets under the control of the trust rather than your personal name, which makes it much harder for anyone else to get at them. I felt the first flicker of relief, until he started listing what he'd need. We'll require the original deeds for any property you want in the trust proof of ownership for your investment accounts and current valuations for each. We'll also need your marriage certificate and James's death certificate to clear any shared title issues. I opened my folder and slid over what I'd brought. He reviewed them quickly, then shook his head. You're missing the original deed for the seaside property and the title insurance documents for the Lake Oswego house. Without those, we can't move them into the trust. They're in the cedar box at home, I said. I brought copies. Copies aren't enough, Caleb replied gently. The county recorder's office will need to verify originals. It's not impossible to replace them, but it takes weeks, sometimes months. I sat back in my chair, the air in the small office suddenly feeling close. I'd come in ready to take action, and here was my first locked door. Caleb must have read the frustration on my face because he added, "Start gathering everything now. The sooner you have the originals, the sooner we can move forward. In the meantime, we can at least prepare the framework of the trust, so it's ready to accept the assets when the documents come in." I nodded, forcing a polite smile, but the sting of the delay stayed with me as I walked out into the drizzle. That evening, David came over for dinner. I made chicken pot pie, James's favorite, and we ate at the kitchen table while the wind rattled the branches outside. Halfway through the meal, Sophie wandered in from the living room where she'd been watching a movie. She leaned against the table, swinging her legs. "Mom says we'll fix up the beach house this summer," she chirped. "She wants to paint it white and get new kitchen counters before they sell it." The fork froze in my hand. "Before they sell it," I repeated carefully. Sophie shrugged the way children do when they've already said too much. Yeah, she said it'll be easier to sell if it looks nice. I told her I like the old kitchen, but she said it's too small. David gave me a puzzled look, not understanding the full weight of what his niece had just revealed. I reached over, smoothing Sophie's hair. That's an interesting idea, I said softly. Why don't you go see if your movie's still playing? She skipped off without a second thought. David glanced at me. What was that about? Nothing you need to worry about right now, I said, forcing a small smile. But inside my chest felt tight, the air sharp in my lungs. The beach house wasn't just another property. It was the place James and I had promised never to part with, no matter the offers, no matter the market. And here they were, already making plans, already counting it as theirs. I finished dinner without tasting a bite, my mind turning over the new urgency of my situation. They weren't waiting. Neither could I. The next morning I called Evelyn Carter. She'd been my closest friend for over 30 years. First as a fellow teacher, later as the one I'd go to when I needed the kind of advice you couldn't get from family. Evelyn had retired from practicing law a few years ago, but her mind was as sharp as ever. "Meet me at Harper's Cafe in an hour," she said without hesitation, "and bring nothing you don't want the world to see." Harper's was half full when I arrived, the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls greeting me as I pushed through the door. Evelyn was already in a corner booth, her silver hair pulled back neatly, a legal pad on the table beside her mug. She looked me over as I slid into the seat across from her. "You sound wound up," she said. I told her everything. Michael's offer, Rachel's phone call on the porch, the blocked attempt to start the trust, and Sophie's innocent slip about selling the beach house. Evelyn listened without interrupting her fingers, tapping lightly on the side of her cup. When I finished, she leaned in. "You can't confront them." "Not now? That would only tip your hand. Let them believe you're grateful, maybe even dependent. Meanwhile, you take your assets somewhere they can't touch." "That's exactly what I tried to do with the trust," I said. "And you will," she replied, her tone calm but certain. "But you need someone who can work faster than the average estate attorney. Someone who understands both the legal side and the financial maneuvering." She reached into her bag and slid a business card across the table. "Olivia Brooks, independent financial consultant. She's handled high-asset clients, many of them older, some in tricky family situations. She doesn't scare easy, and she doesn't talk out of school." I picked up the card. The print was simple, a name, a phone number, an office address in downtown Portland. "You trust her?" "With my own accounts if I had to." Evelyn said, "Call her today. Tell her I sent you." We talked through a loose plan. Evelyn's advice was clear. Maintain the facade. Let Michael and Rachel think I was slow to act, maybe even unsure. Agree to nothing, sign nothing, and keep every move under the radar. "You're not playing for speed," she reminded me. "You're playing for position. But when the time comes, you'll move faster than they expect." I felt the knot in my stomach ease, just a fraction. "Thank you," I said. She reached across the table and gave my hand a squeeze. "James would have told you the same thing. Keep the keys in your own pocket." When we left Harper's, the clouds had broken just enough for a weak beam of sunlight to spill across the street. I stood there for a moment, the card in my hand, feeling its weight as much as I read its words. Later that afternoon, I dialed the number. A warm but businesslike voice answered. "Olivia Brooks speaking." "My name is Margaret Hale." I began. "Evelyn Carter gave me your number. She said you might be able to help me. Protect what's mine." There was a pause, then a quiet, confident reply. "Why don't you come in tomorrow morning, Mrs. Hale, bring whatever records you have, we'll see what we can do." I hung up the phone, exhaling slowly. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was stepping towards something, not just away from it. Olivia's office was on the 10th floor of a glass-front building in downtown Portland with a clear view of the Willamette River, glinting under the morning sun. She was in her mid-40s, polished without being flashy, and had the kind of steady gaze that made you feel both seen and assessed. "Evelyn told me you'd be discreet," I said, as I set my folder of documents on her desk. She smiled faintly. Discretion is my business. Let's talk about what you want to accomplish. Over the next hour, I laid out the situation. Michael and Rachel's sudden interest in my finances, the failed attempt to set up a trust with Caleb Morgan, and the urgency added by Sophie's comment about selling the beach house. Olivia listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a slim leather book. When I finished, she leaned back. You need two things, speed and security. We'll do this in coordination with an attorney who understands the local property laws. I have someone in mind, Caleb Thompson, based in Salem. He's handled cases where family members tried to seize assets from elderly relatives. He knows all the traps. 2 days later, I was in Caleb Thompson's office in Salem, a sturdy building with old oak floors and the smell of coffee lingering in the air. He was tall, with a calm, precise way of speaking, and wasted no time getting to the point. Mrs. Hale Olivia tells me we're moving $1.2 million into a personal trust in your name only. That will involve transferring liquid assets, retitling property, and creating a new primary banking structure. We'll also need to ensure the trust documents specify successor trustees of your choosing, not assigned by family default. I nodded. I want Michael and Rachel completely out of reach of any of it. He gave a thin smile. Then we'll make sure there's no loophole they can slip through. The next week was a blur of carefully timed moves. Olivia arranged for the sale of several stocks in my brokerage account, spacing the transactions so they wouldn't trigger attention. Caleb filed the paperwork to move both the Lake Oswego house and the seaside cottage into the trust once the original deeds were recorded. We opened a new trust account at a private bank in Salem, far enough from my usual branches that Michael and Rachel would never casually walk in. The account required 2 forms of authentication for any access, all tied directly to me. One afternoon, sitting in Caleb's conference room, I signed the last of the transfer documents. The pen felt heavier than it should, the scratch of it against the paper sounding louder in my ears than the hum of the air conditioning. Olivia slid the final folder closed. That's it. As of this moment, everything you've worked for is locked in. Even if someone were to present power of attorney tomorrow, they couldn't touch a cent without your explicit approval. I leaned back in my chair, a slow exhale slipping out. It feels like I've been holding my breath for weeks. Caleb nodded. You've just moved your king to safety. Now they can't checkmate you. We shook hands, and I walked out into the crisp afternoon air. Salem's streets were quiet, lined with maple trees just starting to leaf out. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the weight in my chest finally shift. It wasn't joy exactly. It was something steadier, a deep, quiet satisfaction, like winning a chess game not with a single bold move, but with a series of quiet, deliberate ones your opponent never saw coming. Michael called a few days later saying he and Rachel were in the neighborhood and wanted to drop by. I told him it was fine, and before hanging up I made sure my dining table held a neat stack of completely harmless papers. Old utility bills, outdated bank statements with balances that wouldn't buy a used car insurance policies already paid in full. When they arrived, Rachel did most of the talking, complimenting the tulips on the table as if she'd forgotten she'd given me the last bouquet. Michael picked up the top sheet from the stack, scanning it with the air of a man doing someone a favor. Looks like you've kept up with everything he said, flipping through the pile. He lingered over a bank statement that showed less than $5,000 in checking. I kept my expression pleasant. They send me all sorts of things I barely understand, I said lightly. I figured you might make sense of them. Rachel's eyes brightened and she reached into her tote bag. Actually, we brought something for you to sign, just to make things easier going forward. She pulled out a thick packet clipped neatly with a blue sticky note marking each signature line. It's power of attorney forms and a couple of property documents. Nothing urgent, but since we're here, I let out a soft sigh and touched my forehead. Oh, Rachel, I wish I could. But I've had the worst sinus headache since yesterday. My eyes can barely focus. I'd hate to sign something important without really reading it. She tilted her head in mock sympathy. Of course, we can come back. But the disappointment flashed quick and sharp before she smoothed it away. Michael set the papers back in her bag, patting her arm as if to tell her to let it go for now. We spent another 15 minutes on safe topics. Sophie's school play the weather a new restaurant they wanted to try. Before they left, Rachel giving me that soft smile again, the one that never touched her eyes. That evening, as I was bringing the trash cans in from the curb, Helen Morris from next door waved me over. She was in her late 60s, a retired nurse with a sharp memory and a knack for hearing things other people missed. I ran into Rachel at the market yesterday, she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a recipe. She was telling someone in the produce aisle that the money will be in their hands soon. She sounded pleased. I kept my face neutral, though I felt a small spark flicker deep inside. Did she? Helen nodded, adjusting the strap of her canvas bag. I thought you should know, sometimes people assume more than they should. I thanked her, and we chatted for a few minutes about her garden before heading back inside. Once the door was closed, I allowed myself a slow smile. If they were that confident, they'd be less careful. And the less careful they were, the easier it would be to stay 3 steps ahead. By the 5th month after James's funeral, Michael's patience had worn thin. The phone calls came twice a week now, always starting with polite small talk, before circling back to the same question. "Mom, have you had a chance to look over those papers?" he asked one Tuesday afternoon. His voice had that careful edge, the kind he used when Sophie was dragging her feet about homework. "I have," I said, rubbing my knee as if to ease an ache he couldn't see through the phone. "But these arthritis flares make it hard to sit and focus. I'll get to it when I can." A pause, then a too bright chuckle. "Of course, I just want to make sure you're not letting things slip. You know how fast bills pile up. I've been paying bills for over 40 years, Michael," I said gently. "I think I can manage a few more weeks." The calls continued, each one shorter, tighter. When they visited in person, he would glance around the house as if looking for something out of place. Rachel, less subtle, would steer every conversation back to making things easier for you. One Friday, Michael stopped by alone. He lingered in the doorway after our coffee, saying he had a quick errand to run before heading home. I thought nothing of it until the following Monday when Helen mentioned seeing him downtown walking out of the Columbia Federal branch. The next time he called, his tone was flat, the politeness worn down to its core. "I went by the bank last week," he said without preamble. "Oh," I kept my voice even. "I wanted to make sure everything was in order in case you needed me to step in." He hesitated, and I could almost hear him weighing the words. "Your main account has barely anything in it. Did you move the money somewhere?" I let a beat of silence pass. "I've been paying some things ahead," I said. "Property taxes, insurance. You know how I like to keep ahead of the curve." "That's a lot to pay ahead," he said slowly. "Peace of mind is worth it," I replied, letting warmth edge into my tone, the kind that suggested the conversation was over. He didn't push, but the air between us had shifted. I could feel it even through the phone line. The realization dawning on him that whatever plan he'd been counting on might not unfold the way he expected. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window watching the wind move through the maple in the front yard. The leaves shivered and swayed, but the trunk held firm. For the first time since this began, I knew exactly where the balance of control sat, and it wasn't in Michael's hands. Michael stopped coming by as often. When he did, his visits were brief, polite in a way that felt practiced, like a handshake you give to a stranger. There were no more casual cups of coffee at my kitchen table, no offers to fix a loose hinge or take the trash out. The distance was deliberate, and I let it sit there between us without trying to close it. One Saturday morning, I called David and asked if he could meet me at a diner halfway between Portland and Seattle. He agreed without hesitation. When I arrived, he was already in a booth nursing a cup of coffee. "You look good, Mom," he said, standing to hug me. We ordered breakfast, made small talk about his job and the endless drizzle up north. Then I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "I need to tell you something, but it stays between us." His brow furrowed. Of course, I didn't give him every detail. Only that I'd taken steps to make sure my finances were secure and that Michael and Rachel didn't have access to them. "They've been eager to help," I said, letting the sarcasm wrap around the word. "Too eager." I've got it handled, but I don't want them knowing how. David set his fork down. You think they'd try to take something I think they've already been planning to? I replied. That's all you need to know for now. He nodded slowly. You have my word, Mom. I won't say a thing. For the first time in months, I felt like I had an ally under my own roof, even if he lived 200 miles away. A week later, Helen stopped me on the sidewalk. Saw your son Michael downtown the other day, she said. He was coming out of Miller and Hart's office. That's the law firm on Main. I thanked her, but my mind was already turning over the possibilities. That evening I called Evelyn. She didn't sound surprised. If he's talking to Miller and Hart, he's probably fishing for a way to force a division of assets. The thing is, unless your name is jointly tied to his in ownership, he has no legal standing. A few days later, Evelyn called back with confirmation. I checked with a friend who used to work there. Michael wanted to know if there was a way to claim his share now that James is gone. They told him no. Everything in your name is yours alone. If it's in a trust, even better, untouchable. The news settled over me like a warm coat. Whatever moves Michael had been planning, they'd been stopped at the first gate. He might still circle the perimeter, but the walls were too high now. I didn't call him to gloat, didn't drop hints to make him wonder. I simply went about my days. Morning walks, tending the small garden. James had loved coffee dates with Helen, knowing the foundation under me was solid. By summer, the calls from Michael had all but stopped. Rachel's texts were polite but sparse, mostly photos of Sophie or brief updates about their vacations. The undercurrent of pressure that had hung in the air for months was gone, replaced by something cooler, quieter. I didn't mind the silence. I spent most of July at the seaside cottage. The salty air and steady rhythm of the waves felt like a cleansing, as if each tide carried away a little more of the tension I'd been carrying. I opened the place for seasonal rentals, blocking out a few weeks for myself. The bookings came quickly enough to cover the property taxes and still leave a healthy profit. One morning after walking the beach, I returned to find a thick envelope in the mailbox. The return address was the Salem Bank where my trust was held. Inside was a quarterly statement and a note from my account manager. Your trust has earned $14,300 in investment gains this quarter. I read it twice, then set it on the counter, smiling at the simple affirmation that not only was my money safe, it was growing. Later that week, I drove into town to pick up groceries. At the market while I was weighing peaches, I heard a familiar voice a few aisles over. Rachel's tone was low but unmistakable. We could have done so much with it. But the timing didn't work out. Lost the opportunity, I guess. I froze, listening to the murmur of the person she was speaking to. Then Rachel again. Well, she's got her own way of doing things. Nothing we can do about it now. I moved to the next display before she could spot me, my cart gliding silently over the linoleum. That evening, I sat on the back porch of the cottage, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The ocean was calm, the air touched with the scent of salt and cedar from the nearby dunes. I wrapped my hands around a mug of tea, feeling the weight of it, the heat seeping into my palms. Whatever disappointment Rachel had been nursing, it belonged to her now, not to me. The cottage, the trust, the life James and I had built, they were mine to keep, mine to protect. The balance had shifted completely, and I had no intention of letting it tip again. The waves rolled in steady, one after another, as the last light bled into the water. I stayed there until the sky turned dark, certain that I was exactly where I was meant to be. 8 months is not a long time in the span of a life, but it can be enough to change the way you see everyone around you. And yourself. When James died, I thought the hardest part would be the empty bed, the quiet evenings without his voice. I didn't imagine the real test would come from within my own family, wearing polite smiles and speaking in tones meant to sound protective. I think back to the first time Michael mentioned taking the burden of finances off my shoulders. At the time, it landed like a pebble in my chest. Small but impossible to ignore. What followed was a slow unveiling. Phone calls, visits, suggestions framed as concern, and then behind my back, plans to claim what was never theirs. I could have confronted them early, demanded answers, laid out the evidence, but I knew that would only lead to arguments, denials, and perhaps more cunning attempts. So I learned to hold my tongue, to nod at the right times, to give them just enough to believe they were winning. In that silence, I built something stronger than confrontation, a strategy. With Evelyn's counsel, Olivia's expertise, and Caleb's legal precision, I moved every piece of my life to safety. I turned their assumptions into my cover. By the time they realized the ground had shifted, they were already standing on the wrong side of the line. I never heard Michael admit he'd gone to a lawyer. I never asked him if Rachel's confidence at the grocery store had been an act. It didn't matter. I knew the truth, and the truth was enough. My trust was full, my properties secure, my accounts locked to anyone but me. And they knew it, even if they'd never say the words. Now my days are my own. I split my time between the Lake Oswego house and the seaside cottage. I rent the cottage out in the summer and watch the bookings fill my calendar. I tend the garden James planted, drink my morning coffee on the porch, and walk the beach when the tide is low. There's no hurry in my step anymore, no weight in my chest. I have no interest in punishing them. Life has a way of handling that on its own. I don't need them to say they were wrong or to apologize for the months of manipulation. My victory isn't in their regret. It's in my independence. For women who've been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly cornered, I can tell you this: there is power in not reacting. There is strength in letting others think they know your next move while you chart an entirely different course. You don't need to shout to win. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make is to live well untouched by their control. If you've ever been dismissed or treated as though your choices don't matter, remember, silence can be the sharpest edge. It can protect you, outlast them, and remind you that your life is yours to steer. And sometimes that quiet, steady resolve is the most powerful revenge of all. If this story resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your own experiences in the comments, and if you want to hear more stories like mine, stay connected. You never know whose voice you might find echoes your own.